Okay, I'm bored and I want to talk about something that I find interesting. And so we're going to talk about mug on a rope. And I'm not talking about like Mussolini back in 45. I'm talking about an actual drinking mug on a rope. Sort of the thing that you'd expect. Alright, so here's the problem. Imagine that I have a loose end here. But imagine that this end was anchored to something. I would anchor it to my ceiling if I could use tape or whatever, but I don't really want to fuck it up. But so for all intents and purposes, I'm just gonna hold the other end between my knees, and you see there, it's just tied on. All right. So the problem is, if we have this end anchored and the rope's like a bit more taut, can we use a pair of scissors to cut through this rope and still have the mug attached? And some people might be like smartasses and think, oh, I'll just cut halfway into the rope, or I'll just trim this little end bit here. But no, I think, well, points for being a smartass, but there is an actual way of cutting through this rope right here, right where you'd expect it to be, and still have the mug attached. But before we get into that, I need to talk about something that's kind of unrelated, but not really. I could show you the solution to how to do this, and conceptually you'd probably understand it, but you wouldn't really understand it. So, before we talk about the actual solution, we actually need to talk about something that seems unrelated, as I said, and that is holes. So what I have here is a sheet of paper. One of them's just an ordinary sheet, the other one has a big hole in it, much like your brother's favourite bar of soap in the shower. And we need to ask ourselves a question, and that is, what actually defines a hole? And some people might intuitively think of it as, well, if I come back to my mug here, some people might think of it as how many handles a surface has. And that's kind of a fine intuition, but it's not really the whole picture. And I'm going to tell you why that is. Alright, so if you imagine a straw, and I ask you how many holes a straw has, some people might say it has just one big one that goes down the middle of it. Actually, I've got something here that I can use to show you. So, this is just a tube. Some people might be like, it has one hole here, and it has one hole here. Some people might just say it has one big one that just goes through. So, which of them solutions is right? And for the people who said two holes, or for the people who said one hole, rather, let me ask you a question about this. So, I actually lied. This has a third hole poked into it. And if I ask you how many holes does this surface have, people who said it had one hole to begin with might be changing their mind now and say that it actually has three. But I'm actually going to convince you that this really only has two holes in it. Alright, so if we come back to our paper, there's another concept that we need to talk about, and that is the idea of loops. Alright, so I've got my pen here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a loop as something that we can draw. So something like this, you can see that. So end to end, it's closed. It's a closed loop. I mean, if you don't understand it from that, I can't really help you. So, the interesting thing about loops is that they have a nice property on this surface, right? So, hopefully you'll agree with me in saying that if I draw any loop on this surface, I can sort of maybe contract this. And what I mean by that is I can just draw it smaller and smaller, like that. And eventually, it's going to collapse into a single point, and it doesn't matter how I draw it. I could go from one side of the paper. I could come over and join back up. And even still, you can sort of imagine this loop sort of wrapping round and then like falling onto one side maybe, and you can still contract it to a single point. But now we're going to look at our other surface, and my dog's kind of going mental because someone's just walked in the house. Alright, but if we imagine our surface that has a hole cut into it, we don't actually get this property. And maybe you can see why. So, if I draw my loop, and then you can imagine that it comes through the hole. Something like that. Yes, we can all see that. Then you can see that we're not going to be able to retract this, at least not without squashing our paper down, like this, to a single point. So, loops have this really, really interesting property. They kind of indicate to us where a hole is on a sheet of paper, or any other surface really for that matter. You know, you got like a mug. I could draw a loop around this, and you can see it's still going to get caught on the handle. You know, if it goes through the handle, that is. So why does this matter? And this matters because, let's imagine that I took my pair of scissors and I cut along this loop. I'm not actually going to do it, but now let's imagine that we do the same thing for this sheet of paper. We can cut along the loop, any loop that we draw, and hopefully you'll agree that this piece of paper would just collapse into two different parts. You know, let's actually just cut along the loop that I drew beforehand. Imagine that we've retracted it or wherever. Just a little bit. It breaks off into two pieces, but if I try the same thing with the loop that I drew on this paper, and I will actually cut it, I lied earlier. You see that it still stays as one surface. So, we can think of the number of holes that a surface has as being the number of times that we can cut it, and it's still staying as one piece. That's really the trick that we're using here, so hopefully you can conceptualize that a bit better. I'm just going to get rid of that. So, one other thing as well. So I've shown you that if you have a piece of paper with a hole in it already, then we can cut it. But there's also another way that we can obtain having a hole in our piece of paper, and that is if we wrap it around and then we glue it together. Yes, we get a tube, and you can see that if we cut along where we just glued it, it springs back and it's still one piece. And I mean, that's how you can imagine our tube as well, right? Imagine this is actually stuck in. You could cut along like this, like L shape, and you could do it on the same on the bottom. And what you see is that it really is just a two-hole surface. We can cut it twice, and it still all stays together. Alright, so let's get rid of that as well. So, with our knowledge, what we're going to do is we're actually going to secretly, and again, if I anchor this, we're secretly going to take our rope, and we're going to make a hole in it just by tying it. And this is what I meant by if I showed you the solution, and if I could actually tie the knot, it'd make sense to you conceptually, but you might not have the deeper understanding of it. But if I pull this knot nice and tight, and this looks a little slack, but you can see I could stick my scissors through there, and I could cut this, and it still wouldn't fall. And that's pretty much how you solve the problem.